Thelma, would you mind stepping into the dining area?
Well, what do you want?
With my coffee, I would like one rum.
It was supposed to be just another classic night of television history being made. A harmless comedy scene from a beloved show that millions of families gathered around to enjoy. But what no one knew at the time was that one single unscripted moment would quietly plant the seed of a controversy so powerful, so uncomfortable, that it would eventually contribute to the disappearance of an entire television legacy. Behind the laughter of the Honeymooners, behind the perfectly timed jokes and studio applause, something real and unfiltered slipped through the cracks, something that was never meant to be seen, and yet it was captured forever on camera. For decades, The Honeymooners was more than just a sitcom. It was a cultural cornerstone, a symbol of early television comedy that defined an era. But what makes this story so disturbing is not just what was filmed, but what happened in a matter of seconds when the script was no longer being followed. In that brief window, the polished world of television broke down, and what emerged was a raw, unscripted truth that would later raise questions about the people behind the characters, the pressure inside the studio, and the hidden tensions no audience ever suspected. And yet, the most chilling part is this. At the time, nobody realized what had just happened. The audience laughed. The cameras kept rolling. The episode continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. But in the shadows of that moment, something irreversible had already taken place. Something that would later be dissected, debated, and ultimately blamed for changing the fate of the show forever. Because this wasn't just a forgotten blooper or a harmless mistake. It was the beginning of an incident that would follow the Honeymooners for years, resurfacing in whispers, interviews, and finally, in a truth so uncomfortable that it helped push the show toward its quiet disappearance from the spotlight. But what exactly was said? What was done in those unscripted seconds that made this scene so dangerous in hindsight? And why did it take years before anyone truly understood its impact? The answer begins with a moment that looked like comedy, but felt, in reality, like something far more unpredictable was unfolding right in front of the cameras, long before that unscripted moment would ever be questioned. The Honeymooners stood at the peak of early television success. It wasn't just a show, it was a phenomenon. In living rooms across America, audiences tuned in week after week to watch the explosive chemistry between Ralph Kramden and Ed Norton, two characters who felt so real that people often forgot they were watching a performance. But behind the scenes, the atmosphere was far more intense than the laughter suggested. Television in that era wasn't the polished, endless production machine we know today. It was live, unpredictable, and unforgiving. One mistake could ripple across the entire broadcast. Every joke had to land. Every pause had to be timed perfectly. And every actor carried the silent pressure of knowing that millions were watching in real time. What most viewers never realized was how tightly controlled everything was supposed to be. Scripts were carefully written, rehearsals were repeated, and timing was rehearsed like clockwork. Yet even in this controlled environment, there were moments when emotion slipped through. Small improvisations, slight deviations, tiny cracks in the structure that made the show feel alive, but also unpredictable. And it was in this fragile balance between structure and spontaneity that the seeds of something unexpected began to grow. Those who worked closely with the production would later describe moments where tensions quietly surfaced. Long shooting hours, the pressure to maintain comedic perfection, the expectation to deliver laughter on command. All of it built a kind of invisible weight that sat behind every episode. On screen, it looked effortless. Off-screen, it was anything but. And then there were the performances themselves. The chemistry that made the show iconic also carried an edge, an intensity that made improvisation both magical and dangerous. Because when the script was stretched even slightly, reality had a way of slipping in through the gaps. Looking back now, historians and fans often point to subtle signs that something deeper was always just beneath the surface. A reaction that lingered too long. A pause that felt unplanned. A delivery that carried more emotion than the joke required. At the time, none of it seemed important. But in hindsight, it all feels like a slow build toward a moment that would eventually break the illusion completely. And when that moment finally arrived during filming, it didn't just disrupt a scene. It quietly altered the way people would see the show forever. Because what happened next wasn't part of the script at all, and yet it ended up becoming the most talked about moment in the show's entire history. It happened during what was supposed to be just another routine scene, nothing special, nothing unusual, just another carefully timed exchange between characters that audiences had seen countless times before. The studio was warm with laughter, the crew was relaxed, and the rhythm of the performance felt familiar, almost comforting. But in the middle of that comfort, something broke. A line was delivered slightly differently than rehearsed. A reaction came a fraction too late, or perhaps too early. It was small enough that most people in the audience didn't notice anything at first. But on camera, in the unforgiving silence between jokes, something unplanned slipped into view. A look lingered longer than it should have. A tone shifted. A response that wasn't fully in character escaped before anyone could stop it. And in that split second, the illusion of scripted perfection cracked open. For a brief moment, it wasn't just characters on a stage anymore. It felt like real people reacting under real pressure. The energy in the room subtly changed, almost as if everyone instinctively recognized that something had gone slightly off course. But no one knew how to correct it without drawing attention to it. So they did what professionals do in live television. They continued. The scene moved forward. The laughter resumed. The script was pulled back into place like nothing had happened. But the camera had already captured it. That unscripted fragment, small, almost invisible in real time, was now permanently recorded. And this is where the story takes its most unsettling turn. Because after the episode aired, that moment didn't just fade away like a forgotten mistake. It began to circulate. First as a quiet discussion among viewers who felt something different in that scene. Then as a topic of debate among television insiders. And slowly, it evolved into something far bigger. A question mark hanging over the production itself. Why did that moment feel so real? Why did it break the rhythm so noticeably in hindsight? And most importantly, why did it seem like no one in charge ever wanted to talk about it again? Behind closed doors, there were discussions. Editors revisited footage. Executives reportedly debated whether certain live performance risks were worth continuing. Nothing was officially confirmed, but the atmosphere surrounding the show began to shift. It was no longer just about comedy, it was about control, perception, and what happens when a perfect illusion shows its first crack. And that single unscripted moment was now at the center of it all. But what no one realized yet was that the consequences of that scene were only just beginning to unfold, and the fallout would slowly grow into something far bigger than anyone expected in the days after the episode aired. There was no public scandal, no official statement, and no dramatic headlines screaming about controversy. On the surface, everything looked normal. The Honeymooners continued its run, and audiences kept laughing as if nothing had changed. But behind the curtain of television production, something subtle but irreversible had begun to shift. People close to the show started noticing a strange silence around that specific episode. It wasn't discussed in promotional interviews. It wasn't replayed as frequently in reruns. And when it was mentioned in passing, conversations tended to move on quickly, almost deliberately. It was as if everyone involved had silently agreed not to dig too deeply into what had happened in that unscripted moment. But silence often speaks louder than words. Within the industry, small whispers began circulating. Some said the moment revealed too much humanity in a format that depended on precision. Others believed it exposed the fragile boundary between performance and reality in a way that made executives uncomfortable. In an era where television was still defining itself, control mattered, and anything that disrupted that control was treated carefully, sometimes quietly pushed aside. What made it even more complicated was how audiences reacted over time. At first, most people didn't notice anything unusual. But as reruns circulated and viewers re-watched the episode, discussions began to grow. Online forums decades later would pick apart that exact scene frame by frame, pointing out the awkward pause, the shifted tone, the moment where laughter felt just slightly out of place. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. That's when the story began to take on a life of its own. Not as an official controversy, but as something far more powerful in the digital age: speculation. Fans debated what was supposed to happen versus what actually unfolded. Some insisted it was harmless improvisation. Others believed it hinted at deeper tension behind the scenes, tension that was never meant to reach the audience. Meanwhile, the show itself began to fade from its once dominant position in cultural conversation. It wasn't canceled because of one moment alone. Nothing in television history is ever that simple. But the momentum shifted. New shows emerged, new formats took over, and the Honeymooners slowly transitioned from current entertainment to nostalgic memory. And still, that unscripted scene remained, frozen in time, unexplained, uncomfortably real. Because the most disturbing part wasn't what was said or done in that moment. It was how easily it slipped through an entire production system without anyone stopping it. How a single fragment of reality managed to escape into a world built entirely on performance. And as the show quietly stepped out of the spotlight, one question lingered in the background, unanswered and growing heavier with time. Was that moment simply a mistake in live comedy? Or was it the first sign that the illusion was never as stable as everyone believed? And the answer to that question would eventually lead to a truth far more unsettling than anyone expected. Years passed, and what was once a weekly television staple slowly transformed into something else entirely, a memory, then a reference point, and eventually a legend that people debated more than they actually watched. The Honeymooners didn't disappear because of one single unscripted moment. No show ever truly ends because of just one scene. But sometimes a single moment becomes the symbol people attach to a much larger shift that was already happening. And that is exactly what happened here. The so-called unscripted scene grew into something bigger in public imagination than it ever was in reality. Over time, it stopped being just a brief on-air deviation and became a story people used to explain the fading of an era. It became a talking point, a theory, a piece of television folklore that blurred the line between fact and interpretation. Some viewers believed it represented a deeper truth about early television, that beneath the laughter, everything was more fragile, more controlled, and more emotionally complex than it appeared. Others saw it as nothing more than a small imperfection that history exaggerated into myth. But in both interpretations, one thing remained consistent. That moment stuck. And that is what makes it powerful. Because television history is not only shaped by what is officially recorded, it is also shaped by what audiences feel they witnessed, even if the meaning evolves over time. That single fragment from the Honeymooners became a mirror for how people think about live performance, authenticity, and the invisible pressure behind entertainment. In reality, the show's legacy was never erased. It still exists, still influences comedy, still stands as one of the foundational pieces of early television storytelling. But the myth surrounding that unscripted moment added a shadow to its history, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed worlds can briefly slip out of control, even if only for a few seconds. And maybe that is why this story still spreads, because it doesn't just feel like a television moment. It feels like a glimpse behind the curtain of an entire era where perfection was never guaranteed, and anything real, even for a second, could change how people remember everything that came after. And in the end, that is the real reason this story never truly disappeared. Because audiences are still asking the same question today. What else have we seen on screen that wasn't meant to be seen at all? If this story shocked you, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment what you think really happened, and whether moments like this are truly accidents or something far more revealing about television itself.